Hello everybody and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. On today's episode, I have back on the show Derek Ford to talk about a new podcast project that him and some comrades with Liberation School have put together called Reading Capital with Comrades, a Liberation School podcast series that systematically walks you through Volume 1 of Marx's Capital. As I say throughout the episode, it does it in a really engaging, succinct, systematic way. It is my personal favorite sort of walkthrough of Capital that I've come across. Cannot recommend it enough for individuals or organizations. I'll link to it in the show notes. Definitely check it out. As a side note, I am sort of, as you might be able to tell, a little congested. I think it's just a regular old allergies or head cold. So I apologize if my voice is a little off throughout this episode, but it should not be by any means distracting. So yeah, this is a great episode. I really encourage people to check out Reading Capital with Comrades. And in this episode, me and Derek just sort of touch on some highlights, talk about the main themes of Capital, how it's applicable and relevant for us today, and talk about some other things. But to really dive into the content of Capital itself, Reading Capital with Comrades is a wonderful, wonderful source. So hats off to everybody behind that project. And without further ado, here's my discussion with Derek about Marx, Capital, and Reading Capital with Comrades. Enjoy.
I'm Derek, and I am a teacher and researcher in addition to being an organizer. So I teach at a small liberal arts college called DePauw University and live in Indianapolis. And, in terms of my sort of professional work, it's really about the connection between pedagogy and political movements. So, the books that I've written are primarily about that. The next one coming out later this year is about, it's called Marxism, Pedagogy, and the General Intellect Beyond the Knowledge Economy. And it's ultimately shows that there's a certain pedagogical logic undergirding the capitalist knowledge economy, and then shows that there's some sort of, that much of the left-wing work on the knowledge economy basically has the same pedagogy. And then makes the claim that, well, we have to have an alternative pedagogy for an alternative social system. And so then I developed some resources in that direction. And then I've been organizing more or less since I was in middle school. I organized my first sort of protest in 8th grade, and later organized a protest in the next year when Giuliani, who was then the mayor of New York, was running for governor of New York State. And it wasn't really until, and then in college, I organized, we started a labor action committee. And through that work, we began participating in the anti-Iraq war movement, which is how I met the PSL. And I joined the PSL in 2007 and started a branch in Baltimore, and later moved to Syracuse, where I was for several years and organized there. And then I was in Philly for a quick year, and then have been in Indiana, in Indianapolis for the last several years. And we have a really great, vibrant branch here as well. And then since 2016, I've been editor of Liberation School, which is the PSL's sort of online Marxist university / kind of like more theoretical journal. And I work on that with a really great collective of comrades. And so I'm really excited about the future of that project in particular. So hopefully that's a little bit about me, unless you have any questions or anything you want me to go into more.
Yeah, no, I think that gets at the basics of it, and longtime Rev Left listeners will remember you from a few years ago. We had you on to talk about a visit you did to the DPRK, and that was a wonderful conversation. I can't believe it's been several years already, but we're glad to have you back. And especially with that new book coming out, of course, you have an open invite to come back on the show anytime and discuss and promote that. And I really appreciate the topic of that book as well, so I'm excited about that. But today we are going to be talking about a podcast series that you put together with your comrades over at Liberation School called Reading Capital with Comrades. And I'm going to obviously link to all to the podcast in the show notes, and I highly encourage people to check this out. As I told Derek before we started recording, this is the single best systematic walkthrough of Capital that I've personally ever come across. The sound quality is high. The little interspersions of like questions that sort of take you out of the text and ask a question about it is really wonderful. When you do extended quotes of Marx, for example, there's a background music to let you know that is being done. So like sometimes when you're listening, somebody will jump into a quote and you won't know, is this the person talking or is this the quote again? Like, when does it stop? Those little things can make a big impact on people's ability to learn a topic, especially one as capital or as complicated as Capital. So, I mean, I really love it, really encourage people to check it out. And on today's episode, we're just going to be talking about it. So maybe the best place to start with regards to this conversation overall is just sort of, why did you want to make the podcast in the first place? And why did you want to focus on Marx's work, Capital?
Yeah. So, I mean, thanks so much for those sort of words of encouragement. Definitely means a lot. And, it's really what we hoped would happen. So, I mean, Capital has been a guiding resource for the workers' movement since its publication. And it's been the subject of a lot of debate within the movement and with really important political implications, right? And in the US over the past few decades, much of this sort of debate has been confined to academia, right? And the main political impact of that has been to contribute to Marxism's isolation from the people's struggles. And this is what we in the PSL refer to as the break in ideological continuity that emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because not only of the collapse, but also the way that it happened, right? The fact that it was sort of managed by the leadership of the Soviet Union and without any mass, street-based resistance, right? So this was really demoralizing to the international communist movement. And, that combined with the ideological onslaught against Marxism, it really, discredited the Marxist vision of transformation in the eyes of many. And so in its place, right? I mean, prior to that, Marxism had been, one of the primary guiding forces in people's struggles, various people's struggles. But after that, right, it was, a lot of sort of academic theories that, whatever their merits, weren't really premised on the struggle and the necessity for the working and oppressed classes to actually take power into their own hands, And so that's changed a bit in the last few decades, right? And even more drastically in the last few years. More and more people are, favor socialism, call themselves socialists, are joining socialist organizations and parties or working alongside them. And so now that socialism is gaining in popularity, we have this momentous opportunity, right? And so our tasks are, one, to sort of give definition to socialism, to show what it is, what the struggle is, and then also to reestablish Marxism as a guiding pole in the various struggles that our class is engaged in. And, not everybody needs to read Capital to do this, but I think the more organizers that read it, the better we can understand and then intervene to change the exploitation and oppression that we deal with and fight on a daily basis. So, and also organizers want to read the text, right? And I think that's evidenced by the, growing resources available for it. So I taught Capital in various settings over the years, and we ended up putting up a version of an online class on Liberation School. And it had, it was good because it included worksheets, there were some video lectures, but it wasn't super appealing because like the PowerPoint slide, it's basically like watching PowerPoint slides a lot, right? Mm-hmm. And then, there were things we wanted to change. And at the same time, podcasts, as you know, are like increasingly popular, right? And there's a few podcasts on Capital, but, they're quite a commitment because they tend to be really long. And some of them are just audio versions of lectures. So like the speaker will reference a diagram on the board and you have no idea what is happening. They also aren't really from the perspective of like revolutionary organizers trying to apply the text to struggles today. And so we wanted to address these issues, right? We wanted to create an inviting, an accessible podcast that was professionally designed, professionally executed, that was made for those who are reading along, but also for those who just wanted to listen along. And that was from, the perspective of militant communist organizers. And so the idea came from Mike Preisner initially, who has a lot of experience as a producer, who currently produces the Empire Files. And we brought in Patricia Gorky and who does a lot of work on audio. And the three of us were the editorial team. So I'd record the episodes, they'd listen to them and think about edits to make, right? What kind of questions to ask, what we needed to spend more time on, and then, ways to break up the episode, like you had mentioned. So, Nick de la Riva did a lot of the sound editing, and Anna Hedron made the music for it. And I think they did a really good job focusing on those minor details. And then Nathan Schmidt made all the graphics for it, right? And we made, like compelling titles and descriptions of each episode. So I think all that together makes it, like really unique. It took a long time. It was about, 6-8 months or whatever, but I think it turned out well. It's great to hear your positive feedback. We've gotten others, and it's interesting. In June, somebody sent me some listening statistics from the different platforms it's on. And on SoundCloud, the city with the second most listeners was Baghdad. Wow. The fifth was San Francisco, and the seventh was Berlin. So it's got an audience beyond what we had originally anticipated.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love it. And your teaching skills particularly are wonderful, and they shine through when it comes to this podcast, and specifically how you molded your already existing teaching skills for the platform. As you say, there's sometimes these lectures that get put into an audio platform that they otherwise, or they initially were not meant for, and that can make the learning process a little more jagged and rough. But on every level, from production to the way that the material is presented, it is perfect for the platform of audio-only podcast. And then the reason that I focus so much on podcasts, and I think that the medium is so popular, is, among other reasons, you can listen to it while you're at work. I got into podcasts working shitty jobs in retail and fast food and kitchens, as a delivery driver, as a dishwasher, and it kept my mind stimulated intellectually while my body went through, the sort of rote procedures of any low-wage labor job. And I got into it very early, and I think that that's a unique advantage of the podcast platform itself. And what better way to spend a day being exploited at your wage labor job than to dive deep into a critique of capitalist political economy?
Yeah.
Yeah. And one thing you mentioned also in the intro episode is, and I think this is true to learn anything, but specifically difficult texts like Capital, is these things are very helpful, but also reading in a group is very helpful. The attempt to try to tackle Capital by yourself, especially with limited historical context and not really knowing what you're getting yourself into, can be very difficult. Adding a group, even one or two other people, to read it together can be very helpful. And adding a group plus an educational platform like Reading Capital with Comrades and mixing all those elements together, I think, is the best approach to it. And you make that clear as well. So well done on all fronts. How many times have you personally read through Capital and or taught it?
So I think I taught the book about maybe 6 times to in various settings. So I taught it once at school, and I taught it a couple times for just workers wherever, and comrades wherever I was living. I taught it to party members once, and then I guess this was the last time, my most recent time teaching it, and the most difficult because you don't know who's listening to it, So
yeah.
in all the other iterations of teaching it, you could what people are, what their jobs are, what their interests are, so you can bring those in and make it a more sort of dynamic and applicable thing. So that was definitely a challenge. And then I don't know, I think I've read the book maybe 10, 12 times, all the way through. And each time I read it, I learn something totally new. There's just so much in it. And that was another difficulty, right? We wanted to make the episodes not super long. And so, we had to figure out all right, what are the key points? And then, what are the few sort of, arguments or applications that we want to make explicit.
Yeah. And I think all told, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but there's 12 episodes and all of them are under an hour, right?
Yeah, I think so. And some of them might be 30, 40 minutes, and then some are closer to the hour mark.
Yeah. So it's really approachable and succinct in that way. And you pull out the major themes, but you do so in a way that doesn't drag on for 2-3 hours, which, is off-putting to a lot of people, and it makes it more difficult to engage with. So the systematic approach, the production levels, the way that it's taught, the person who teaches it, and the amount of sort of individual episodes that it takes you to go through Volume 1, all of it is wonderful. Can't recommend it enough. But now that we've talked about the show, and the reasons for doing it. Let's sort of talk about the content of the book. Now, obviously, in a 1-hour podcast, we're not going to be able to get super deep. If you want to get super deep, check out Reading Capital with Comrades, which I'll link to. But just to touch on some things and to help people approach the overall topic, I guess the place to start here is just a question that's very general, which is, what is capital, right? The namesake of the title itself, and why and how and when was it written? Maybe just some historical context that can help us understand the era and the milieu in which Marx wrote Capital.
Yeah, sure. Good question. Important questions. Capital, a critical analysis of capitalist production, right? The first volume is on the process of capitalist production. And this was the only volume that was published and republished and translated during Marx's lifetime. And so, it's sort of the most complete, overall synthesis of really Marx's studies that we have. And Marx didn't want to critique political economy to out of some academic interest, right? I mean, he needed to, because the workers' movement needed it, because, after the uprisings throughout Europe in 1847, 1848, which Marx and Engels and others participated in, some of which failed, and there was a period of intense reaction afterwards, where Marx was kicked out of Germany. So he eventually ended up in London. And basically, Marx and Engels didn't really think that they were in the Communist League at that time. A lot of people in the League believed there would be an immediate resurgence of struggle after the counter-revolution, right? And Marx and Engels disagreed. And they were like, well, there's going to be a period of, sort of reaction for a bit of time. And one thing we need to do is we need to study why the revolutions failed and how we can better arm our class for the next battle, right? And this doesn't mean, so Marx started engaging in this real systematic study of political economy and of capitalism, holding himself up in the library quite often and transcribing and translating all these reports and, studying, the bourgeois political economists and more. But obviously he was still involved in sort of day-to-day organizing. So it wasn't disconnected, right, from the struggle. But it was all oriented towards defeating the influence of what Marx earlier called social democracy in the workers' movement. And so it's really the book that makes it possible to talk about Marxism as a theory, right, which I think is important. At the same time, right, it's, Marx doesn't talk about everything that capitalism is. One, he's talking about the production of capitalism predominantly, but, he's not saying that this is all that's considered. And I think that's important because that's evidence in the text, right, where he'll say well, in reality, this happens, but I'm not considering it because I'm assuming a perfectly functioning capitalist system, right? So the idea was kind of to critique capital on its own terms and have a lot of different people speak through it, factory inspectors, bourgeois political economists, opponents in the workers' movement, and others. So those are some things that made it possible, and it was written really in the 50s and 60s, published in 1867. He was working on several other volumes at the time, right? 2 was almost done, so we have that. Engels finished that. 3 was it's kind of a mess. There's debates about, just how much of it is Marx's, how much is Engels or whatever. But, volume 1 is really what we have, right, of Marx's most sort of systematic and comprehensive study of the dynamics of capitalist production and the class struggle.
Yeah. Do you know much about the initial reception of the text when it first came out?
Yeah, well, so it was received. So in the workers' movement, it was read very widely, but it was read really widely, and so it was subject to ruthless critiques by the bourgeoisie and their political economists. And so one in the last preface to the book, which is by Engels, I think it's the preface to the 4th German edition. It's basically Engels just defending Marx from, this Cambridge professor who Engels refers to as our little Cambridge man, who had attacked it in the Times and these other places. So it was immediately subject to the bourgeoisie didn't want it out there for sure. And that's because it would be the Bible of the working class movement.
Yeah, absolutely. In the intro episode of Reading Capital with Comrades, you talk a little bit about dialectics and the famous phrase of Marx turning Hegel on his head. Can you just talk a little bit about that and how dialectics plays into the structure and the approach that Marx took when it came to writing Capital?
Sure. So I think that one of the most important categories, conceptual or methodological principles, is that of abstraction, right? That capitalism is, one, it's a dynamic system. Two, even in Marx's time, it was it was an incredibly comprehensive system that had expanded and was expanding over increasing parts of the globe geographically and in other ways. So to look at something like that that's moving, right, and also that you're inside of, it's really difficult. And so the process of abstraction is basically beginning with what's called the real concrete, right, the world as it is, and then breaking it up into discrete units, and the ones that make sense, right, and that follow and that are historically specific, right. And that's really one of Marx's major innovations, right. Previously, right, political economists had talked about labor, they talked about capital, they talked about profits, but Marx was like, well, these aren't the best abstractions because profits are a subcategory of surplus value, right. So he made these abstractions, and then he sort of used them to reconstruct the totality, right, or the real concrete, right, which doesn't change it, right. It's just sort of what's called the real concrete in thought. And in terms of, turning Hegel on his head, obviously there's a lot of debate about this. I mean, I personally think that, by turning Hegel on his head, Marx meant that, he had sort of broken from Hegel significantly. But, Hegel's understanding of really historical transformation and the dialectic was that it was guided by ideas, which had a sort of objective, external relationship to the world. And that the way that we change the world is through, changing ideas, right? And Marx, said that, well, that's not the case, because we can actually look at the historical, political, economic reasons why Hegel would say something like that, why people would, sort of go to that kind of methodology. And so instead he begins and he's like, well, the dialectic means that, everything is in transformation, right? And that things are being negated, things are coming to birth and dying at the same time. We can't understand anything in isolation, right? We have to understand it not only in relationship to other things, but also in ways that relationship actually defines what the thing itself is, right? And so I think that those are a couple of the key points. What do you think? Did you have anything else you wanted to, that you found important?
Yeah, I liked particularly how you talked about how capital and the way that Marx approaches the mode of production of capitalism was scandalous to the bourgeoisie, in that it saw capitalism not as an end-all be-all of political systems or an end state of cultural evolution, but as largely a historically contingent process that has a birth and, by sort of definition, also has a death. And that, I think, is incredibly important, and that's one of the first steps that I think lots of Marxists make, is busting themselves out of the sort of ideological assumption that the way things are today is more or less the best humans can do. It's the best system we've ever created. It's presented to us as if capitalism is synonymous with freedom and democracy, so why would you even want to think about replacing it with a different system? And when you talk to people, liberals, conservatives, libertarians, a presumption that they have, often unexamined, is that they truly do see capitalism as a static state of affairs. It's like, we've reached this, and maybe if I'm a liberal, I want to reform the edges. Maybe if I'm a libertarian, I want to take away some of those reforms and let it rip. Maybe if I'm a conservative, I have some other cultural concerns that I want to approach within the confines of capitalism. But the question of whether capitalism could possibly have an end, almost never comes up. And when you present that as an argument, and then you show how capitalism grew out of the early mercantilist machinations coming out of feudalism and et cetera. It just opens them up, and their sort of unexamined prejudices come out. So I really like that point, and I think it's just important to reiterate it.
Yeah, definitely. And, that's because the abstractions they made were inaccurate, right? So they would talk about the individual, and then they would project that individual back throughout, history. as if all of history was leading up to this, and this is the culminating social system. And, so what Marx does is really, he just takes that apart and he shows that, no, this is like the individual itself is a product of the 18th century, and that, our very conceptions of freedom, equality, justice, these are sort of superficial and contingent definitions. And we need to interrogate that, critique that.
And destroying the just so story of capitalism that you talk about in the series of, this, it's like the hardworking, frugal person versus the lazy squanderer, and the people that are successful in capitalism are successful because of your really individual characteristics, not systemic and historically contingent variables that prop some people up and make it impossible for others to move upward at all. So yeah, on many fronts, it's important. I want to move on, and I want to say that, as you've said, Capital is not just a critique of political economy. It's a huge work that spans history, philosophy, etc., and that can make it more difficult for people to approach the text, given the largesse of what it covers and the different approaches that it takes. So, with that in mind, how did you personally approach the text? Do you have any perhaps recommendations for people when they are coming in to approach the text that might not have as much knowledge in, let's say, philosophy as they might in history, or political economy as they might in philosophy?
Yeah, so I think, one thing is to try to read it carefully, because when you read the text carefully, you recognize the moments where Marx is explicit about what he's doing and what he's not doing and what he's assuming, and whether those assumptions are actually viable or not, and what he isn't taking into account. So to sort of really try to see, on Marx's terms, what he's trying to do. And then also to read it as a text that isn't the work of an individual genius, but is really, a work that wouldn't have been possible without the class struggle, without the experiences and organizing that Marx and Engels and others had. And, recognizing that that's in the same way that reading Capital with Comrades isn't the work of any one individual or even the collective of individuals who worked on it, right? That it's a book of, by, and for the workers' movement. That's really what Marxist theory is. I mean, Marxism is like the workers' movement reflecting on itself. And then, approaching the text, I think just reading it as for what it's trying to say, in the context, the time in which it was written, and, what we today can, how it can help us build the different movements that we're involved in, right? Advance the class struggle.
Yeah. And let's talk about that a little bit, because this is a text from the 1800s, and for some this question will be obvious, but I think it's worth asking nonetheless, especially to people who might be unsure about this. So what is the relevance of this text for us today?
Yeah, so I think, the first thing is that, we're still in capitalism, right? And, the sort of overall dynamics and logics that Marx articulates are still with us today. Automation, for example, Marx talked about why that happened in the 1860s, and it's different today, but it's the result of the same logics, right? The same law of value, and things have changed, obviously, right? But there's a lot that hasn't. For example, there's all this talk about the precariat today, but if you read what Marx was writing about the impact that capitalist industrial production had on the working class, it was making them precarious, right? And so there's a lot of continuities between Marx's time and ours, and then including the function of the state and more. So it's really about how can we identify the capitalist contradictions that Marx shows us, and see how they play out historically and today, and how can we seize on them, to raise consciousness and to create more effective campaigns that really attack the structural and root causes of any issue. And so that our campaigns are not, they appeal to broad sectors of the working class. They're not based on the very categories that Marx was critiquing, right? Like morality and humanity and all that kind of stuff, right? But they're based on the structural logics that produce the problems that we're trying to solve.
Generally, to effectively confront and overcome something, you have to have a deep understanding of it. And so if we want to confront and overcome capital, we have to understand how it works. And importantly, we have to understand how the seemingly disparate problems of modern day society have common roots, and that they can be traced back to a common sort of structure that imposes these problems and disallows us to effectively solve them. One of those problems that is increasingly relevant and is probably going to be, if it not already is, the issue of the 21st century is climate chaos, the climate crisis. In what ways does this text, does Marx's understanding and explanation of capital help us understand something like capitalism's connection to climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, and there's a lot, I mean, one of the most basic sort of processes that Marx identifies is abstraction, right? So the way that capitalism abstracts like particular things and makes them all equal. So, capitalist commodity production makes different kinds of labor equatable, right? Which is why I take my wage, which I get from my labor, and with selling my labor power, and I go to the store and I can exchange it for all other kinds of, specific forms of labor power. But capital doesn't really care about those specific forms, right? It cares about exchange value, which is an abstraction away from all use value. And it does the same thing with the environment, right? It takes the world and basically presents it as sort of an abstract, geometric, body that is a resource, right, to further capital accumulation. Obviously, there's also, Marx acknowledges and pays a lot of attention to the environmental preconditions, right? What makes capital sort of more profitable in one place, or a certain kind of production more likely to develop in one place rather than another place, right? In other words, what are sort of some of the roots of uneven geographic development? And why is it that the first centers of production sprang up on portside towns, for example? Well, because transportation was easy and because it had access to water power. But then with the invention of sort of electric machinery, capital was able to further abstract the globe because it was able to sort of produce sources for its production processes anywhere. It didn't have to be located. And that's really, capital is all about movement and flexibility, right? That's why I was able to defeat feudalism in England, because feudalism is tied to the land. Capitalism isn't, right? I mean, that's why it can outsource industries overnight to another, area without any consideration of the impact of that, right? And so just by viewing everything as a potential exchange value and as a potential source of profit, that's why we're in the situation that we are today.
Absolutely. And I think a core tenet of denialism in all of its forms, lurking behind it is a dogmatic commitment to unfettered capitalism. And so you'll see almost everybody across the political lines accept that climate change is happening. Even fascists, neo-Nazis, they accept that climate change is happening, and they're ready to take, full advantage of the chaos to spark their race war, to what will amount to just hurting innocent people, etc. The one segment of the political spectrum that refuses to acknowledge it is precisely that segment that is most committed to unfettered capitalism, the conservative libertarian sort of milieu. And they know, if not consciously, then subconsciously, that to meaningfully address climate change would require us to meaningfully address capitalism and to change those structures to make it more in line with a more sustainable approach to the world, etc. And so instead of becoming aware of that cognitive dissonance and working through it, they just turn to the various forms of denialism. Now, for most of our life, that denialism was explicit, outright rejection of the science. This isn't happening. If it is, it's not human caused, etc. That's falling apart. And now I think the new line that some of them are taking is, well, there's nothing we can really do about it, just adapt to it. Now, of course, if you ask them to pass a bill to allow us to tax the rich so that we can make our communities more resilient to climate chaos, they'll say, no, that's socialism, we're going to filibuster it, etc. But there is this shift recently where they can't outright deny it because it's so objectively obvious to everybody, and so their denialism takes on a little different form. And so I think in a million different ways, we could have an entire episode on just capitalism's connections to climate change and how it affects our politics. But that's certainly one of them. I personally would love to bring, Marx and Engels into the 21st century and let them see things like the 2008 financial crisis, the handling of the pandemic, the inaction globally from especially capitalist states when it comes to climate change. And I think more or less they would be, horrified on one level, but it would completely make sense to them that this is the sort of logical conclusion of another 150 years of capitalism. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's another place where there's so much continuity, you know?
Yeah.
Marx talks about pandemics and capital, talks about financial crises. And yeah, we can't explain and understand these current crises that are, gripping us and determining so much of our lives and directions without understanding these core logics of capitalism that, as you say, is something that, sort of connects so many different forms of exploitation and oppression, including the exploitation of the earth and all of its inhabitants.
Absolutely. So I want to talk about common misunderstandings because I think this runs the gamut, right? There are good faith and bad faith misunderstandings of Marxist theory. There's misunderstandings of Marxist theory on the far left all the way to the far right and everything in between. But just generally, I guess, what are some common misunderstandings of the Marxist theory, and how does Capital clarify those misunderstandings?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, what's interesting is so many of these misunderstandings come out of readings of Capital, right? But I think that, they're ones that don't do what I was talking about earlier, right? Which is like, reading it carefully and seeing what he's explicit about and what he's, not taking into account and why. And for example, right, Marx writes that he focuses on England because it's where capitalism is most developed, but also where there's the most official statistics on it, right? Like factory inspector reports, right, which are cited at length. Especially those of Leonard Horner, who Marx gave like really, really high praise to. But, he also says that as much as capitalism is developed in England at the time, other modes of production exist, right? So the very first sentence of the book is like the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails, presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, right? So a lot of people point out that Marx says appears or presents, which means it's not really true. But also Marx says capitalism prevails, right? Not exclusively reigns. And so this is an important acknowledgement, right? That there's other modes of production existing in any one given social formation. And it's also important because England provides the basis of it. So it's not a universal theory or story imposed on everyone equally. He later wrote to a Russian journal that success will never come with a master key of a general historical philosophical theory, right? And that would be anti-Marxist because it would be ahistorical, right? Exactly. But it's often read like that. And I think another is to distinguish what Marx's ideas are, what his vision is, from what capitalist realities are, right? So for example, like when he talks about productive labor as labor that's directly productive of surplus value, that's the capitalist definition of productive labor. That's not the Marxist definition of productive labor. But then again, right, later on, he says that all workers, whether they're employed or not, whether they're waged or not, are just as much appendages of capital, right? They're just as much a part of capitalist production as others. So he's definitely just not concerned with like male factory workers or like England or whatever, right? And in fact, he writes about how industrial capitalism changes gender and family relations. So, the introduction of machinery, for example, right, made the employment of small children possible. And so he says that, the man became a slave dealer, right, of the labor of his wife and children. And he talks about, the general law of capitalist accumulation is the production of ever more and more, unemployed workers, right, who are just as much a part of the working class as those who work for a wage or work as productive laborers or whatever. And then again, I think one is Marx's, the last section on primary accumulation, how the original capital was accumulated through expropriation and murder, pillage, legislation, individual acts of terrorism, genocide, slavery, right? But he says that this history is different in different countries and goes through different phases, different orders, and so on. So again, it's not a universal presentation, right? And it's not something that's over. It's not the same everywhere. For example, he denied that he didn't think that pre-capitalist India was feudalist. So it really prevents us from reading like a unilinear progression of history in the accounts. And, even when Marx presents general laws or tendencies of capitalism, he'll immediately say that, they're modified in a million different ways. So they're not immutable and like permanent mechanical processes, right? And of course, the entire book is about class struggle, which includes the abolitionist movement, anti-colonial struggles, right? And all these modify how capitalism plays out on the ground. So I think that, obviously there's so many others, but I think to me that those are some of the ones that come to my mind first.
Yeah, and you said earlier that every time you read the text that you sort of learn something new. And I was, just as you were talking there, I was sort of wondering, this last time that you read through it, does anything particularly jump out in your mind as like, oh yeah, I might have missed this the first several times that I read it, or maybe even just put a different spin on something that you already sort of understood but hadn't really seen from a certain angle or anything like that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that one of them is the coexistence of different modes of production in any given social formation. This time around reading it, it's not that I really focused and I saw so much of Marx appreciating and, taking into account or at least acknowledging this isn't a universal unilateral theory, and that it isn't a sort of, stagist progression of history. And like, if you just read certain sections in isolation from each other, you can come away with that, right? But I think when you read the text as a whole, you really see that Marx is constantly taking into account like the great differential sort of developments of capitalism, the ways that resistance relates to capitalism, and the way that capitalism relates to resistance, and the way that it's sort of not confined, that it isn't taking a study of capitalism in England and trying to say that this is it for everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I personally have been trying to articulate recently, specifically thinking about the importance of decolonial struggles within the Marxist framework in a revolutionary struggle, is I started talking about the four-headed beast of capitalism. A lot of people on the left know that capitalism is inherently linked with fascism and imperialism. That's very clear, and therefore to be anti-capitalist also requires of us to be anti-fascist and to be anti-imperialist. I think it also requires us to be anti-colonial and to support decolonial struggles, which Marxism historically has played a huge role in and continues to. So with that in mind, and the sort of four heads, just to be very clear, is capitalism, imperialism, fascism, and colonialism, which sometimes can get left out of the conversation. And bad readings of Marx, or sort of white social chauvinist angles on reading Marx, can sometimes leave out the role that racism and colonialism and other forms of oppression play. So what does Capital say about these things, specifically racism and colonialism?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the most famous line, one of the most famous lines is, that labor in white skin can't be emancipated where it's branded in black skin. That, the working class in the United States will never be emancipated while there's slavery. And so that's why Marx himself, was really concerned with the U.S. Civil War, wrote a lot about it, advised Marxists who were participating in the abolitionist movement on tactics, strategies, and so on and so forth. And because he was always aware of the way in which capitalism differentiates and pits the working class against itself, right? When he talks about the Industrial Reserve Army, he talks about the various, Lazarus is the word he uses, layers of it, right? And the different functions they can play. And from, those who are temporarily unemployed to those who are, the sort of dangerous classes who don't want to be employed. And, how those different elements can sort of be pitted against those workers who are waged. And the other thing is that Marx ends the book with a chapter on colonialism, right? And interestingly, I mean, there's a lot known about his relationship to the Irish question. Obviously, he's in England at this time, and England is a colonial power still today over Ireland. And initially, Marx and Engels thought that they had to have a socialist revolution in England, and then Ireland would be emancipated. But later, right, after actually acknowledging the deep-seated chauvinism amongst English workers against the Irish, they were like, no, we have to fight for the liberation of the anti-colonial struggles in Ireland, as part and parcel of the socialist struggle in England. And, his notebooks also show that, the class struggle was global, and included anti-colonial struggles in China, for example. So in one of his notebooks, he wrote that China's rebellions in the, mid 19th century could throw a spark. This is a quote, throw a spark into the overloaded mine of the present industrial system and cause the explosion of the long-prepared general crisis. So his theory of value, his theory of class was one in which, that was not confined to the colonizing world, but that actually located the centrality. And in fact, acknowledged that the sort of detonator of the class struggle could be in an anti-colonial struggle. And I think this is, especially important for Marxist theory of value, right? I mean, which has to do with the constant expansion of value and the ways in which value can't constantly expand forever, and it has to then destroy a bunch of value, right? And that helps explain, imperialist wars today. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that from the sort of practical organizing that they did to support anti-colonial movements, the abolitionist movement, for example, by organizing workers to prevent England from intervening on behalf of the South in the U.S. Civil War, which they were about to do. And, England at the time had the world's largest navy, so it could have really impacted the way that the Civil War played out. So that they were not only thinking about these things, but they were actually fighting them on a sort of day-to-day basis.
Yeah. One of the things in my political development that really stood out to me and made me commit to Marxism and then, get really interested in Leninism and Maoism is the role that Marxism has historically played in decolonial movements and its effectiveness in those contexts specifically, and still to this day are continuing to play huge roles. And so there is this sort of like this ignorant sort of neoliberal identity reductionist who like to sometimes throw out these claims of like, stop reading these white men, they have nothing to offer us. And I think it misses so much. It sort of betrays an ignorance about the methodology of Marxism and the historical role that it's played in precisely overturning racist forms of oppression, colonialist forms of oppression, etc. But with all that said, there's obviously no doubt that Marx and Engels, given their epoch and where they're writing from, have some blind spots. But that's the beauty of Marxism, is that it's not this dogmatic doctrine handed down to us by Marx and Engels. It's an analysis and a methodology that we take and we build on and we apply in our own circumstances. And I think that goes a long way to rebuking some of that.
Definitely. And like I said, they never said they were going to analyze every single thing, right? And I mean, there are forms of oppression today that we can understand by reading Capital. We can better understand by reading Capital, right? But there are forms of oppression that, Marx and Engels during that time, that maybe weren't as they weren't in the consciousness, right, of the masses, for example.
Yeah. And just structurally, because you talk about this in reading Capital with Comrades, why do you think Marx put the primitive accumulation chapter at the end? I just think it's worth touching on.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, throughout the book, Marx says, we're assuming that, the presuppositions of capitalism are here, right? And then we finally get to the chapter, the last part, right? The various chapters on, how the original capital was accumulated. And I think that this really brings together, he's talking about the case in England primarily, right? But capitalism in England, he shows, couldn't have developed without slavery in the United States, right? Without the colonization of India, without the colonization of China, without the subjugation of so much of the world, right? The genocide of the indigenous peoples. And, but again, he's saying that this isn't the only way that it plays out. He isn't saying that it's historically over. And then what's interesting though is that, so the second to last chapter, chapter 32, is the historical tendency of capitalist accumulation. It's a couple short pages, and it's a really quick, succinct, overview of capitalism in England, right? And it's really compelling. And if you read it in isolation, you might be like, oh my gosh, this is a little deterministic and whatever. But when you take into account all the other things, you see that it's not. But it ends with the call, right, for expropriating the expropriators. It's sort of a militant call to arms. And then you go to the last chapter, which is about this guy's theory about colonialism and, colonization. And it's it ends on that. And so you're kind of what's going on, and David Harvey has an interpretation of it that has something to do with Hegel's reading or Hegel's logic and how Marx is reproducing that or whatever. But, in my mind, Marx is saying, and not just mine, but others too, is that we talked about capitalism in England, but we talked about how it depended on colonialism, but it can continue to depend on colonialism. And it can, it's the story that he told in chapter 32, right? Where, the means of production and the relations of production, they're disjointed, something has to give way, they're holding production back, they're holding, the world back. But then by ending with the modern theory of colonization, he's basically saying that, well, there's other ways the capital can sort of delay, but also heighten these contradictions by bringing them to a more global level. And that's really where Lenin's theory of imperialism originates, right?
Exactly.
And, without Lenin's theory of imperialism, which integrates, right, the national question with the class question, shows that they're not separate, but they're part and parcel of each other. And the ways in which that contributed so much to the liberation of so much of the world is really important, right? But I mean, I think that's why it's important to note that's why he ends this entire book there, rather than calling for us to expropriate the expropriators.
Yeah, and it's also why Lenin is so essential. He really is taking the Marxist analysis and critiques and applying it in a new age, the age of rampant imperialism, and extending the understanding. So very, very crucial. Okay, so let's move on. We have a couple more questions here. We're coming up on the hour mark. But one important element, and I know this is something that you put a lot of emphasis on and just general, is applying this stuff in our own organizing effort. So how can or should we apply and develop capital in our own age of organizing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways for sure. I mean, I think that one of the things that stands out to me the most is the way that Marx theorizes the state and the relationship between reform and revolution. So, at the end of chapter 10 on the working day, where Marx details, right, based on the factory inspector reports, like the absolute horrors of the industrial system, the murders that it's responsible for, right, the degradation it's responsible for, and he calls that, he ends that chapter with a call for the workers to put their heads together and pass an all-powerful social barrier that would limit the working day to 10 hours, and obviously that would be reform that would take place through the state, So also in that chapter, he talks about the state really as responsible for two things, right? One, it's managing the contradictions, obviously, between the different classes. The other is that it's managing the contradictions within the capitalist class. So, because if each capitalist were left on their own, they would basically kill everything that makes them profitable. And so the state needs to step in to manage those contradictions. And so, workers need to utilize the state to win reforms, right, to advance the class struggle so that they can, so that we can, organize more effectively, have time for more organizing, right, and also show that we can change things. I mean, that's really, really important. But then he talks about revolution, expropriating the expropriators. And so these aren't, diametrically opposed, but they're dialectically related, right? They're both part of the overall strategy for, in the struggle for socialism and then communism. I think another is, the value of labor power versus the wages of labor power. So, and, really the difference between value and price. But, the value of labor power is it's basically determined by class struggle. What does it take to reproduce something? The working class, right? Well, that changes over time, and we can fight to increase the value of labor power, which we've done historically. The working and the capitalist class will fight to reduce the value of labor power to its bare minimum, even below its bare minimum. But if we can show that, the value of labor power includes my or our schooling, right, going to college, right? If a job requires you to go to college, then that's your labor. That's included in the value of your labor power. And so they should pay for your college, right? Not you. You're basically subsidizing the boss by paying for your part of the value of your labor power. So I think that's a great agitational point to make that can also help us connect the struggle to abolish student debt and for free education to the very capitalist system, right? And, really, I think that, Marx's law of value is, it's a law that operates above our heads and behind our backs in ways that no individual can control, but that expands, right? And it creates contradictions that are sort of delayed in various ways, right? We talked about imperialism and colonialism, but that, we're powerless as individuals to really change things. And that capitalism, it shows us, creates a collective working class at the same time as it tries to constantly decollectivize us and individualize us. And that's obviously, one of the primary struggles we have today in the US is to think of ourselves as members of a class and not as individuals. So I think those are a couple of examples in terms of how we can apply the text today.
Yeah, well said. And, Marx famously did not get into the game of predicting what's going to come in the future or saying a whole bunch about exactly what socialism and communism will look like. And that's, I think, to credit his epistemic humility. but it also, can lead to a bunch of different factions of people taking, Marx's words and trying to say, well, this is actually the sort of socialism he meant, or this is what he actually meant, etc. That's something we all still live with. And this book itself, Capital, is a book mostly about capitalism and how it functions. So with both of those things in mind, how does Marx think about socialism and communism in and through this book?
Yeah. So, I think one thing is that really Marx is talking about capitalism and communism, right? Socialism is sort of, a social formation that includes both modes of production, right? It's the period in which, the communist mode of production is battling to defeat the capitalist mode of production. And the way that he figures communism is very different, he talks about at one point early on, right? It's it's a free association of laborers, right? Operating according to a plan. So there's an element of freedom in there, but it's also a planned freedom, right? Because you can't have you can't really allow the productive capacities of society to develop unless there's a sort of plan, right? And so I think there's a dialectic then between, this sort of notion of freedom and this notion of planning and sort of centralized planning, which he emphasizes throughout. And at different moments in the text, he talks about this. These two different sort of definitions, right? These two components of the communist future. And they're present in volume 1. And then volume 2, because it focuses on the reproduction of capital, it talks a lot more about, the planning that's needed in communism and how, as much as bookkeepers are needed in capitalism, they'll be needed even more under communism. And then in volume 3, he kind of returns to this, to what he does in volume 1, where it's kind of both these elements of it. But he also talks about throughout all 3 volumes, that just as there's no, pure capitalist mode of production without elements of other modes of production, that we can sort of see elements of, the communist mode of production, even in capitalist societies, right? So he talks about joint stock companies at one point, free education, those kinds of things, which doesn't mean that that's communism, but it means that these are elements for communism in the same way that there were elements of capitalism in non-capitalist societies that capital was able to sort of seize on and then, enforce, right? And so we have to be attentive to that as well without thinking that these themselves are the path to communism or these are communist, right? So I don't know, the fact that knowledge can be shared online, right, without cost, and that challenges private property, because private property is based on scarcity and non-reproducibility and rivalry. So if I have access to something, you can't have access to something. Well, knowledge is very different, because if that's why my books are available for free online, right? Yeah. It doesn't take away anything from me, right? And in fact, it increases our productive capacity, because the more people who have access to that knowledge, the more we can do with it. But that doesn't mean that, it's communism, right? Or that's necessarily, because it's still under the capitalist mode of production. But with that, we can see the ways in which we already kind of parts of our society and our relations are already contain elements of the communist future within them. Right. And we can, highlight those and show how much better they are than the ones that are capitalist elements.
Yeah, exactly. And by identifying them, we can also consciously cultivate and extend them. And that's an important aspect too. And I think that's one of the insights of dialectics more broadly is, it's not like feudalism ends and then capitalism starts. It's like the seeds of capitalism start appearing in the middle and late feudal era, and then these developments occur. And the same is true for our time, right? Elements of socialism and communism, or communism, because socialism is this transition towards communism, exist. And it's our job to identify and extend those and to show, as you said, how they are superior to the capitalist alternative. And that's going to become more and more important as the climate crisis particularly ramps up, because people are going to start seeing, they're not going to be able to turn away from the fact that the way that we do things economically, politically, socially is just not sustainable. They don't work anymore, and people are going to be looking for alternatives. One of the alternatives, or at least a false alternative presented as a real one, is the fascist one. The Fascist Appeal, very simplistic, racialized, tribalistic, scapegoating narratives of it's these brown people or it's the Jews that are in charge that are doing this, etc. They have the advantage of having a very base, simple explanation for everything. It's wrong in every single way, but they do have that advantage. We have to take on the obligation and the responsibility to understand these things ourselves, and then be able to go out and teach people these things and to connect up their personal struggles, what they're going through in their lives that they care about, with this broader movement to building a better world. I think Capital is absolutely crucial for that, and teachers like you, Derek, that can take a complex work like Capital and make it understandable to everyday working class people are also essential in that process. So I thank you for that. Now, Reading Capital with Comrades goes over Volume 1 of Capital in 12 episodes, as we said earlier, under an hour each. Do you have any plans on continuing this with Volume 2 and 3, or are you just kind of seeing how the reception of this first Volume 1 turns out first?
Yeah, so so we want to do Volume 2 next, and so I've kind of started that a little bit, but it's going to be sort of a different beast altogether. But I think it would be really useful, really helpful, because it's often presented as like a super boring, and there are some parts that are like a little more dry, but there's actually a lot in there about the class struggle, a lot of really inspirational, like mobilizing, energizing theories and concepts, and also a lot of concepts that help us understand, for example, the environmental crisis, right? And how capitalism produces nature and space in certain ways. So yeah, we are working on that. I can't tell you when it'll be out, but because this was a big project and it took up a lot of time. So we also kind of needed a breather from it and wanted to get it out there and let it sort of, get feedback from it too before we started the next one. But yeah, that's definitely in the works. I don't know about Volume 3. We'll have to sort of, take that later as it comes. But in the meantime, I do think that there's a lot, for people who listen to it and want to read more. I mean, obviously, read Marx, read what's on Liberation School. I do get asked, though, like, okay, I've listened to this, I've read Capital, what's next? And I mean, I think there's a couple books. The first one I always recommend is Harry Haratunian's Marx After Marx. I think it's Turkish, but it's a book from, I think like 2014, maybe, that talks about shows not only how Marxism was taken up throughout the third world, the global south, and developed, but also how Marx's theories themselves allowed for that and took that into account. And another one is David Harvey's Limits to Capital, which is old. I think it's from 1983. But for those who are interested in a lot of like the, academic debates, but also, some political debates with real implications, Harvey's got a really good grasp and a really good way of presenting those. And then there's also somebody named Radhika Desai, who's I think at the University of Alberta, but she's really does amazing work about Marxism and understanding the contemporary configuration of imperialism. So those are some of the things that I definitely recommend, which speaks to another way, another reason that it's important to emphasize that not only are there communist elements present under capitalism, but that, Marxist ideas actually have transformed the globe, right? I mean, they have eliminated exploitation, right? They haven't created a communist world, because that can't happen as long as capitalism exists. But that, we need to take inspiration not only from what Marx wrote, but from the more than a century of the actual workers' struggle that we have that's actually created successful socialist experiments that continues to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Derek, for coming on the show again, talking about this, and for you and all the comrades behind Reading Capital with Comrades, all the work that went into it, the collective effort that went into it. I cannot recommend it enough. I will say again, it's my personal favorite walkthrough of Capital that I've ever come across. And you can listen to this individually, as you say in the intro episode. You can do it along with Reading Capital and then going to these episodes, or just sort of going to the episodes without having read Capital themselves. You're going to get something out of it regardless. But the best way to do this, and I really want to encourage this aspect, to do it collectively, and specifically if you're in organizations, right? If you are in any sort of socialist, left, communist organization, anti-capitalist formation, taking Reading Capital with Comrades and giving it out to your members and doing a little study group with that resource, I cannot tell you how beneficial and advantageous that would be. So definitely consider that if you're operating in that context. Derek, before I let you go, can you just reiterate where listeners can find that podcast and Liberation School online?
Yeah, sure. So liberationschool.org, and we have a tab, educational resources and courses. And so you can see the Reading Capital with Comrades there. You can listen to all the episodes. They're, sort of embedded from SoundCloud. It's on SoundCloud. It's on, iTunes, Spotify. I think all the major platforms you can find it on. And you'll see that the episodes descriptions or somewhere in there also has an email you can send questions to, or like, for example, if you're studying it in a group, if you want somebody to come on and sort of talk with their group about it after you've listened and studied the book, have a conversation, we'd be more than happy to do that.